Hello and welcome to the podcast Shedding Candlelight on Cryptids, Hauntings, Mythology, and more. If it is weird, we are talking about it. This is your host, Lee Donna, and today's magical tale comes to us from the Cunning land of Germany, where there once lived a witch whose name was Walpurga Hausmännin. If you are watching the video version, I will put that name up on the screen for you. If you are only on audio, rest assured that the name you just heard was pronounced horribly and that the spelling is not even close to how it sounds in my native American English tongue. So, to keep from further dishonoring this poor woman, I am going to call her Val. Val lived in a German town with an equally hard name to pronounce, but this town was in the state of Bavaria, which today is known as the Free State of Bavaria, and it is Germany's largest state by landmass. It is also Germany's second most populated state, but because of the size, Bavaria is still considered not to be too overly populated. It is also considered to be cultured and artsy, and I would dare say progressive or just reasonably minded, because Bavaria was one of the places that denounced the Nazi ideology. Hitler did have a home there, but he ended up not being very welcome. That is not part of today's story. I just have a recollection of coming across certain articles about him and Bavaria in years past. So I'm sharing that with you because before his regime's evil indoctrination, there was yet another systematic destruction of a group of people that swept through Germany and beyond. Our friend Val worked as a licensed midwife. In 1556, she had been employed as a midwife for 19 years. Back in those days, midwives were part of a collective of people, usually women, known as wise women. They were also sometimes referred to as cunning folk. These wise women and sometimes men typically practiced things like medicine, divination, and what some refer to as magic. These wise and cunning humans were the people who understood nature in a way that allowed them to make herbal remedies. They knew when to plant, when to harvest, and how to time things to align with nature, whether it be light and dark or a phase of the moon. They were known to possess practical knowledge, which allowed them to heal many ailments, and they were oftentimes skilled midwives. They also made charms, and some of them would use different rhymes or incantations during their work, or they would give self-help style advice to the townspeople seeking their help, having the afflicted recite these different mantras. In short, these women were wise and they were healers. As such, they were a crucial part of their societies and were held in high regard. One of their roles in particular was to protect people from evil, from witchcraft and all manner of ghastly things. Unfortunately, though, the cunning folk were no match for the power-hungry religious leaders who could not have wise women running around healing the masses. I mean, why go to the church and give them your time and your money when you could just go to the wise woman who would hand you a bag of herbs and tell you to keep the shirt on your back because she was doing just fine without you giving her all you have and then some? It's kind of like people could trust that the wise and cunning folk among them were not going to, say up and deem butter sinful just so they could then tell you that if you pay a fee to them, they could bless your butter and take the sin right out of it, and then you would be free to eat all of the brioche that you wanted. Which is a true story that actually happens, guys. The church wanted a new building, and to raise money for it, they made eating butter a sin, unless you were wealthy enough to pay the church to bless your little buns. And yes, that is the whole let them eat cake thing, which has been grossly misrepresented in more ways than one throughout history. Anyway, by the 1500s, the Catholic religion was getting this foothold on the people of Germany, and the church was doing everything within its power to stamp out the old ways so that people would be reliant on the church for everything. It was the church's way or death, a power they were given by using fear tactics to make everyday citizens lose their ability to reason. Logic flew straight out the window when a man stood up and said, I am holy, you must listen to me, or you will burn in hell forever. Now, obviously, for this man to keep his power, he had to kill every woman with common sense. I mean, how often has this exact scenario played out in history? It's ridiculous, really. But here we go again. And this time, dear old Val is right in the center. Before this rise of the church in medieval Germany, the people did make very clear distinctions between wise women and witches. The wise women were respected and valued. People wanted their assistance. Witches were considered harmful. People wanted to stay away from them because they used dark magic, not the healing power of the wise women, but the kind of magic that was harmful to a person. So that's pretty simple. Cunning folk and wise women good, witches bad, until the church got involved. Wise women used to bridge the gap between the practical and the mystical. Their knowledge of herbal remedies and healing practices were essential, and therefore people relied on the cunning folk, a reliance that was a threat to the emerging indoctrination of Christianity. The church could not claim to have all of the answers if people had someplace else to go for answers that actually helped them in real time, or even answers that relied on the person receiving a charm or a prayer of sorts that required faith. Because the issue isn't magic or unexplained things. Religions are chocked full of magical and even paranormal events that are labeled as miracles and other things. Many religions, like the Catholic one, also use charms. So there was no issue with the cunning folk in terms of what they were doing. The issue for the church was power. They could not control people who were not reliant upon them. They could not control people who had someplace else to go for help. Every war, every atrocity, every witch hunt comes down to power. And what happened in Germany in 1556 was no different. And it was only the beginning. Val's story is the precursor to later and larger witch hunts that swept through the region in the 1600s. Because these women practicing the old ways were a threat to the men running the new Christian religions, oftentimes the church would first target the older women in the community, those who had been around a while and earned themselves reputations of possessing this wealth of knowledge. These women were typically widows who lived on the fringes of society. Some of them owned prime land that men wanted but couldn't get because the women refused to sell their homes. Women were vulnerable because of their age, gender, and marital status. It was easy for the powers who wanted to be to cast doubt and suspicion upon these women. They were able to exploit the imagery of the old crone, solidifying this ideology in the minds of the people so that instead of older women being valued and considered wise, they were looked upon as useless, if not harmful. Armed with this negative perception, religious leaders would go to the people or local authorities with accusations of witchcraft. Once these accusations began to spread around and fear began to heighten, yet more women would then be accused. Older women were most at risk, but also any wife who was not obeying her husband, or a maid who dared to fight back, or a child who didn't want to be sold off to this man or that. All of these people would be labeled as witches. And for the cunning folk, it didn't matter that their healing practices were rooted in wisdom or that healing methods they utilized actually worked. They were accused of using harmful magic, a type of magic they could have only gotten by making a deal with the devil. Val was alive and working during one of these brutal and tragic times of heightened fear that was being incited by the church, whose goal was to stamp out all of the old pagan ways. There had been illnesses and some cattle dying in the area, and Val was involved in delivering several babies who were stillborn. This gave the church all the ammunition they needed to target her, and in 1556, the newly widowed Val was arrested by local authorities. Val was accused of many crimes. Among them were witchcraft, child murder, and vampirism. There was no evidence of any of the dark crimes Val was charged with, so what could the church possibly orchestrate to prove the crimes? You guessed it, torture. All they had to do was torture people until they confessed. Then they got to shrug their shoulders and say, well, now we have to kill them because they just confessed to being a witch. I mean, we don't want that kind of evil walking among us, right? We only have room for the evil crimes committed by those in power: rape, torture, murder, all the regular stuff that the masses tolerate because someone has either money or religion. Yeah, try real hard not to groan. I assure you that I have done enough of that for all of us. While being tortured, Val made several confessions. The first thing her tormentors had to establish was Val's connection to Satan, because that is the classic move. People knew Val. She delivered many of their children, helped them heal of injuries and sicknesses, and she was very highly regarded in the community. So to erase those ties and make people not come to her defense, these horrible men had to pinpoint a time when Val went from good to bad, from light to dark. Then they could say what a shame it was that Val decided to make a deal with the devil. Again, this was a common tactic and one of the reasons widows made good targets. Val's confession about her devilish deal should have just been a script for unmarried women. This is where gender is used to shame a person because women are not allowed to be sexual. Only men, which is funny because it's women they mostly want to be sexual with, and then they try to shame the woman for doing the thing they wanted her to do. The hypocrisy is suffocating, especially back in 1556, when Val is tortured for hours and days on end until she tells them that after her husband died, she had the audacity to invite a man to her house. I mean, that is shameful in and of itself, but to Val's dismay, her male friend did not show up. Instead, the man who knocked on her door was a demon. His name was Federlin, but he was wearing Val's friend's clothing, so she let him in, presumably thinking it was the friend. Then, during sex, she felt his cloven hoof and knew it was a demon. She invoked the name of the Lord, and the demon fled. But the persistent being came back the next night and once again tricked Val straight into bed. This time, while they were in the act, Federlin promised to save Val from the poverty she was now living in. All she had to do was keep sleeping with him. So she said okay, and she did. But demons are not Satan, so Val was further tortured until she confessed that her demon lover took her to meet the big bad. Federlin took Val to Satan himself, and it was there that she swore herself to the devil. No, for real. Val's tormentors got all the details now, so don't laugh like that, because while being tortured, Val confessed that Satan wrote a contract on a nice piece of paper, probably a skull that's buried somewhere in the desert as we speak, And after they both signed this contract where she was giving her body and soul to Satan, they had a glass of wine, roasted some babies, and had sex. Then her demon lover, Federlin, took the now cannibal version of Val back to her little cottage and gave her an ointment that she could use to harm people, their children, and their crops and animals. So naturally, the next part of her torture focused on what she did with this powerful Satan blessed ointment. For starters, Val confessed that she took this special salve and applied pressure to the foreheads of newborns as she was delivering the babies, killing them before they could be baptized so that their souls would go to Satan instead of God. She confessed to doing this little trick 40 times. She further confessed that she also sucked their blood out like a vampire and that she killed both children and animals so that she could use their hair and their bones in her witchcraft. In light of these extracted under torture confessions, local authorities and the Imperial Court of Religious Idiots had no choice but to sentence Val to death. They wanted said death to be an example, not to thwart others from following in Val's footsteps because her confessions were hogwash. What these men wanted was to terrify people so that in the future they would meet with less resistance. So they took this elderly woman who had just endured horrendous torture and paraded her naked body through the streets. During this march, they stopped in 5 different locations using crude tools to rip and tear flesh from Val's hands, arms, and breasts. After all of this, they still had more to prove, so they chopped off Val's right hand, for it was this hand that she had used when swearing what was in essence the Hippocratic Oath when she had 19 years before became a midwife. Then these evil men tied Val's bloody, mutilated body to a stake and burned her alive. After she was gone, they said that none of her could remain on their solid, holy ground. So they scooped up the hot coals and dumped all that remained of Val into a nearby stream. But her gruesome torture and execution was still not enough for them. They also confiscated all of Val's belongings, not so they could give this property to someone in need, but so it could become property of the church. Val's brutal torture and murder was the fate of many, and in the 1600s, yet another witch hunt craze sent more German cunning folk to the stake. This fear of witchcraft isn't simply fueled by people's fear of the unknown or supernatural. In fact, ideologies in patriarchal societies both feed and create belief structures that get ingrained into people's minds. Women are painted as weak minded and susceptible to being led astray by the likes of Satan. Therefore, they need a man to control them, which is why women have to submit to their fathers or their husbands. If something goes wrong in the household, like the husband or the father is a piece of dirt, well, it's the woman's fault. And if you are an older woman who no longer possesses the beauty of youth, well, what good are you if men can't look at you and fantasize anymore? I mean, really, all you are good for at that point is causing plagues and droughts. Once that gray hair hits, like I've got right here, you begin to live solely in scapegoat city. At least before, when you were young, you got to have like a toe outside the borders of that city, but now you are all in and there's no getting out. And if your husband passes on before you do, well, you better call Lilith because Federlin sure as heck did not help Val. That's how we know Satan is a man. All the women who get mixed up with him end up burned alive while he's still out there living his best life. Truly, Val's story is a tragic one, and it is sad that we have so many of these stories in our recorded history and still have similar things happening today. There are too many modern day stories where some controlling person uses religion to murder other people. There are children being killed in exorcisms and all of this other nonsense, while we have serial killers and people whose abuse and torture of children is on video, and we let them live in our prisons with so many creature comforts. It is messed up. And no, not all men are evil. I am fully aware of this, the same as I am aware that not all women are angels. So if you are a man and you don't like my attitude when it comes to covering the atrocities committed against women and children, then do not listen to my show. And also, do not be a hypocrite. Do not do to other people what you would be outraged to have happen to you. That last bit is advice for everyone, as is the advice to think for yourself. Let's get off of the bandwagons and get back up onto our soapboxes. I would also like for my family to stop referring to me as a witch. I now demand that they call me O Wise One, High Mistress of the Cunning Folk. If you would like to send me your cunning stories, you can do that by emailing me at leadonabooks@gmail.com. My website is leadonabooks.com, and this month's Patreon is about an unsolved murder where ghosts and witches are among the suspects. That one will be up sometime in the month of June 2024, and you can find it at patreon.com/Leadonna. I do not have much internet access these days, but you can follow my social media if you want to. I can be found using some version of Lidonna or Lidonna Author. And no, I have no clue when my next book will be published, because to publish, I must first write the book. And that simply is not happening because a witch cursed me. Where is the church when you need them? I don't know, guys. Stay tuned though. And until next month, High Mistress out. Bye.
Immortal monsters.